The French Secret Service bombed the Rainbow Warrior ship. That's the short answer. It was a clear, deliberate act. And it happened a long time ago, back in July 1985. But it's a story that still has a lot to tell us about governments, secrecy, and the price of protest. Back then, Greenpeace was a big deal. They were known for getting in the way of things they thought were wrong. One of their main targets was nuclear weapons testing. France at the time was doing a lot of these tests in the Pacific Ocean. They did them at a place called Mururoa Atoll. It's a tiny speck of land, thousands of miles from anywhere. But Greenpeace saw it as a big problem. They believed these tests were bad for the environment. They thought they were dangerous for the people living nearby, and they wanted them to stop. So Greenpeace sent their flagship, the Rainbow Warrior, to the Pacific. Its mission was to protest these French nuclear tests. The ship was famous. It had been in many battles with whalers and seal hunters. It was a symbol, and it was heading to Mururoa Atoll. But before it could get there, it made a stop. It went to Auckland, New Zealand. This was a normal port of call. The crew was resting. They were taking on supplies. They were preparing for the next leg of their journey. The French government did not like Greenpeace. Not one bit. They saw them as a nuisance. They saw them as a threat to their national security. France was a nuclear power. They believed they needed to test their bombs. It was part of their defense strategy. And Greenpeace was getting in the way. The French felt these protests undermined their sovereignty. They thought Greenpeace was trying to embarrass them on the world stage, and they decided they had to stop the Rainbow Warrior. They wanted to make sure it never reached Mururoa Atoll. This decision came from the very top. It wasn't just some low-level plan. The French president at the time was François Mitterrand. He knew about the plan. His Minister of Defense, Charles Hernu, was also involved. The operation was given to the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure. That's the DGC. It's France's foreign intelligence agency. It's their equivalent of the CIA or MI6. And they were told to make the Rainbow Warrior disappear. The DGSE came up with a plan. They called it Operation Satanique. It was a secret operation. It involved several teams of agents. These agents were highly trained. They were experts in sabotage and covert action. Their mission was clear: neutralize the Rainbow Warrior. And they decided the best way to do that was to sink it. One team of agents was sent to New Zealand first. Their job was to gather information. They were to watch the Rainbow Warrior. They were to find out its schedule. They needed to know how many people were on board. They needed to know where it docked. These agents used fake identities. They used fake passports. They posed as tourists. They posed as environmentalists. They moved around Auckland without drawing attention. There was a woman named Christine Caban. That was her cover name. Her real name was something else. She pretended to be a tourist. She hung around Greenpeace activists. She even worked as a volunteer for a while. She gained their trust. She collected vital intelligence. She found out details about the ship. She passed this information back to her superiors in France. She helped set the stage for the attack. Then came the main team. This team was responsible for actually sinking the ship. It included two agents who would become very well known later. Their names were Major Alain Maffart and Captain Dominique Prieur. They posed as a Swiss couple. They called themselves Terenge and Maffart. They rented a camper van. They acted like ordinary holidaymakers, but they were anything but ordinary. They were military officers. They were trained saboteurs. They were there to carry out a very specific, very dangerous mission. Another team also arrived. These agents were from a special operations unit. They traveled by sea. They used a yacht called the Uve. It had sailed all the way from New Caledonia. They also had a rubber dinghy. This was the boat they would use to get close to the Rainbow Warrior. They would carry the explosives in it. The plan was simple but brutal. They would attach 2 limpet mines to the hull of the ship. Limpet mines are special bombs. They stick to the side of a ship. They explode underwater. And they are designed to sink vessels. The agents planned to detonate them at night. They wanted to make sure no one was seriously hurt. They thought the crew would be asleep. They hoped they would have enough time to evacuate. The night of July 10th, 1985 was the target. The Rainbow Warrior was docked at Marsden Wharf in Auckland. It was a cold, dark winter night in New Zealand. Most of the crew were on board. Many were asleep. A few were still awake, enjoying the quiet. Around midnight, the agents made their move. The rubber dinghy, launched from the Uvea, approached the Rainbow Warrior silently. The agents attached the 2 mines to the ship's hull. They set the timers, and then they left. They got back into their dinghy. They headed back to their yacht. They thought they had done their job cleanly. The first explosion happened at 11:38 p.m. It ripped through the engine room. It was a massive sound. It shook the ship. It created a huge hole in the hull. Cold water started gushing in immediately. The lights went out. The ship listed heavily. The crew woke up in a panic. They scrambled to figure out what was happening. Some thought it was an accident, maybe a gas leak, maybe a problem with the engine. But then, just 10 minutes later, a second explosion hit. This one was even more powerful. It blew a larger hole in the ship. It sealed the Rainbow Warrior's fate. The ship was sinking fast. The crew knew they had to get off. They started to abandon ship, but they were trying to help each other. They were trying to get to safety. One person, however, didn't make it out. His name was Fernando Pereira. He was a Dutch photographer. He was working for Greenpeace. When the first explosion happened, he went back inside. He wanted to get his cameras. He wanted to save his equipment. It was his livelihood. But the second explosion trapped him. He drowned in the rapidly rising water. His death turned the sabotage into something much darker. It became a murder. And it changed everything. The New Zealand police started their investigation immediately. They knew this was no accident. 2 explosions meant it was deliberate. It was sabotage. And the fact that a man had died meant it was a criminal act. They quickly found pieces of the rubber dinghy near the scene. They knew this was a key piece of evidence. It pointed to a sophisticated operation. The police were good, they were thorough, they didn't have much to go on at first. But they kept digging, they found a camper van, it had been rented by the Terenge and Mafart couple, it was abandoned, and inside it they found clues. They found some French government documents. They found diving equipment, they found evidence that linked the couple to the bombing. And then, a breakthrough. The police had already been tracking a suspicious woman. This was Christine Caban, the reconnaissance agent. She had left New Zealand before the bombing. But her movements, her activities seemed connected, and they had a lead on a boat, the Uvea. On July 12th, just 2 days after the bombing, 2 people were arrested. They were Major Alain Mafart and Captain Dominique Prior. They were trying to leave the country. They were caught at the Auckland airport. They had their fake Swiss passports. But the police knew they were involved. They were taken in for questioning. At first, they stuck to their cover story. They were innocent tourists. They knew nothing about the bombing. But, the police didn't believe them, the evidence was mounting, and New Zealand was furious. They had a foreign government attacking a ship in their harbor, killing one of their guests. It was an outrage, it was an attack on their sovereignty. France's reaction was swift. And it was a flat-out lie. The French government denied everything. President Mitterrand said France had nothing to do with it. His defense minister Charles Hernu also denied any involvement. They tried to portray it as an isolated act. They hinted that maybe Greenpeace itself was responsible. They spun a story that Greenpeace was trying to get sympathy. It was a ridiculous claim. No one bought it, especially not the New Zealanders. But the pressure kept building. The New Zealand police kept uncovering more evidence. They knew Terenge and Mafart were not who they said they were. They were able to trace their identities. They found out they were French military officers. They were part of the DGSE. And that made the French denials look even worse. Journalists started digging too. Edwy Plenel, a reporter for the French newspaper Le Monde, was particularly important. He worked tirelessly. He uncovered details, he spoke to sources, he found out how the operation was planned. He found out who was involved, he started to piece together the truth. As the evidence mounted, the French government's position became untenable. They couldn't keep lying. The world was watching, New Zealand was demanding answers, and the truth was starting to come out. Eventually, President Mitterrand had to act. He commissioned a report. He asked a senior civil servant, Bernard Tricot, to investigate. But the Tricot report was designed to protect the French government. It admitted that DGSE agents were in New Zealand. It admitted they were gathering information. But it claimed they were only doing reconnaissance. It said they were only trying to track Greenpeace. It concluded that the agents acted on their own. It said they went beyond their orders. It was another attempt to minimize the damage. It was another lie. But the Tricot report didn't fool anyone, especially not Edwy Plenel. His reporting in Le Monde directly contradicted it. He published articles that showed the DGSE was deeply involved. He showed that the operation was sanctioned at a high level. He exposed the full extent of the French government's deception. The political fallout in France was massive. Charles Hernu, the Minister of Defense, had to resign. He took the fall. It was a scandal. It was an embarrassment for France. The world condemned their actions. It was an act of state-sponsored terrorism against a peaceful protest group, and it happened in a friendly country's harbor. Meanwhile, Major Mafart and Captain Prior were still in New Zealand. They were charged with murder, and they were facing a long prison sentence. Eventually, they pleaded guilty to manslaughter. This was a deal. It allowed them to avoid the murder charge. But it still meant they were responsible for Fernando Pereira's death. They were sentenced to 10 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. France desperately wanted its agents back. They pushed for their release. They put huge diplomatic pressure on New Zealand. New Zealand resisted. But eventually, a deal was made. It was brokered by the United Nations Secretary General. The 2 agents would be transferred to Hao Atoll. This was a French military base in the Pacific. They would serve out their sentences. It was supposed to be a neutral solution, but France didn't honor the deal. Mafart and Prior were released early from Hao Atoll. They were hailed as heroes in France. This infuriated New Zealand. It deepened the diplomatic rift. New Zealand felt betrayed. They had held up their end of the bargain. France had not. The bombing had lasting consequences. New Zealand broke off some diplomatic ties with France. Trade relations suffered. It took years for things to normalize. It showed the world that even friendly nations could be targeted by state-sponsored violence. It showed that governments would go to extreme lengths to protect their interests, even if it meant breaking international law, even if it meant killing an innocent person. Greenpeace also received compensation. France paid damages for the loss of the Rainbow Warrior. They also paid compensation to Fernando Pereira's family. It was a small comfort for the loss of a life. But it was an admission of guilt. It was an acknowledgement that France was responsible. The Rainbow Warrior bombing became a symbol. It showed the dark side of international politics. And it showed the lengths governments would go to silence dissent, but it also showed the resilience of protest. Greenpeace didn't stop their work. They got another ship. They continued to campaign against nuclear testing. They continued to stand up for the environment. The original Rainbow Warrior was eventually scuttled. It became an artificial reef. It's now a dive site, a memorial to the ship and to Fernando Pereira. His death was a tragedy, but it also brought the world's attention to the issue of nuclear testing. It exposed the brutality of a powerful nation, and it showed the courage of those who stood against it. In the end, the French Secret Service, acting under orders from the highest levels of the French government, bombed the Rainbow Warrior. They did it to stop protests against their nuclear tests. They sank a ship. And they killed a man. It was a cowardly act, it was a crime, and it was a huge international scandal. The truth eventually came out, and it proved that even powerful governments cannot keep secrets forever. The legacy of that night in Auckland Harbor lives on. It's a reminder of what happens when states believe they are above the law, and it's a reminder of the human cost of such arrogance.